I'd like to throw it over to our friends at Door & Whittier to kick off the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having us tonight. My name is Brad Dorr with Door & Whittier Architects. I have with me tonight Jason Boone, okay, who is our educational planner for the firm, and John Richardson, who is our project manager. And we also have Steve Theron, who is here with representing Vertex, who is your owner's project manager. So tonight is the first official public meeting. Although that being said, we've had 3 public visioning sessions really as an opportunity for our firm and the members of the building committee and the school committee administration to meet with the public and really to go through and start to understand, how do we want to go and operate this school, and how do we want to actually go and design this school, not just for today, but for the next 50 years. And so with that, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of what we've been doing and where we're going to get, where we're planning on going. So we're going to give you a little bit of a process overview with respect to how the various committees work, how we work, and how we work with the Massachusetts School Building Authority, which I'll get into in a couple of minutes, who's ultimately the state partner on this project. So just talking a little bit about the process that we have been going through and where we're headed. So as I was saying, okay, right now, in conjunction with the district, we have an entity called the Massachusetts School Building Authority. And their role really is to act as the state agency who's responsible for funding public school projects. So they're a very important piece of the puzzle. Ultimately, right, they're going to be helping fund this project in the range of somewhere between 40 and 50%. That ultimately will be decided, okay, once we get a little bit further along in the design. But they'll be working, okay, with the district, and as everybody knows, we're here in Groveland tonight, but we also have, Merrimack and West Newbury, okay, comprised in the district. So everybody is going to be involved in this. This is our first public meeting. We'll also be going out, and we'll be having a public meeting in a couple of weeks in Merrimack, followed up by another one in West Newbury. So the way the MSBA operates, okay, they actually break the school building design and construction into 2 phases. The first phase, okay, which is the feasibility and schematic design phase, okay, is what we're in today. And so it all started in spring of 2015 when the district submitted a statement of interest to the MSBA, saying that, at that point in time was actually, we're looking for a new high school. And then as part of that process, the MSBA said, you know what, you also have a middle school that's fairly old as well. Why don't we take a look at both of those facilities? And that's how the process moved forward. You were invited into the MSBA eligibility period, which is really a 270-day paperwork period to be able to go and get all of the documents required to have the MSBA board vote to move the project forward. And to bring the district into, each year there's a select number of towns that actually are invited in, and we were fortunate enough to have that happen in 2016. So with that, after that, and that had been funded already by the towns, Vertex was hired to be your owner's project manager. Our firm was hired to be the designer. You've got a project team, and now we're entering the part, okay, where we really start to put some of the things together, which is the feasibility process. And really, that's where we are today. And that's what we've been doing since, probably November-ish of this past fall. Moving forward, we'll get into this a little bit more. We're going to start getting a little bit more detailed in the schematic design phase. Number 5 is your project funding agreement, okay, which once that's all been formulated as to what the project is and how much it costs, and what the reimbursement and project cost sharing arrangement is going to be, you're going to sign that agreement with the MSBA. Then that will move forward into doing detailed design, okay, as Module 6. We'll complete that. We've already retained a construction manager at risk, okay, so we have a builder for this project once the design's been completed, and then it will go out to bid. And then in somewhere out in 2021 and 2022, which sounds like it's a long ways away, but it's really not. Everybody will hopefully be able to go, and those will be the classes that will be moving into the new school building. This is a little bit more of a breakdown of the feasibility and schematic design phases. As you can see, we've started the public visioning sessions, right? We've done an extensive existing conditions review of both the high school and the middle school. So we know exactly, what's wrong with the building, what's right with the building. We've also done a bunch of programming there to understand how the building is operated, what the size of all of those spaces are. And right now we're in the process, okay, of developing those options and how we might be able to go and put a new school building project together. Once we've taken that, and really what this process is taking a number of different options, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, and boiling that down to one, right, what the preferred option is. And that's going to result from all of the information that we've gleaned from the administration, from these visioning sessions, and also the feedback that we have, okay, from these types of meetings, as well as the thought exchange program, okay, that Dr. Mulqueen will get into a little bit further. Schematic design, as I said, we're going to go and get into more detailed design on that one option that's been selected as the preferred option. We're going to go and have that estimated. We'll have two independent estimates, okay, that will ultimately be reconciled to be able to make sure that we've got the cost right. And then ultimately all of that will be submitted to the MSBA for their board's approval. Subsequent to their board's approval, okay, then you'll enter into the project funding agreement as I described before, and then we'll move forward in terms of trying to go and bring that before all of the towns for a final vote in 2018 this fall. So one of the things that came out of the eligibility period, okay, discussions with MSBA, is how many students actually, okay, will be attending the school. And one of the things, okay, where we are today is if you look at the very bottom there where it talks about the existing number of students, okay, in the high school right now we have about 764 students. However, the future enrollment for the high school, okay, and what's been agreed to with the MSBA is 605 students. And that's showing a declining enrollment, which is fairly consistent throughout the Commonwealth. Similarly, okay, if we were to look at a middle high school solution, okay, you have about 1,225 students, okay, and if you look at the 10-year enrollment projection, okay, that's been performed, we're really talking about a design target of about 965 students for a middle high school project. And again, that's based on a number of analyses that were done and the agreement that was struck with the state. And so what we're talking about here, when we look at those two potential options and the process that we have to go through with the state, we're going to be looking at a high school only option, and each one of those options is going to look at a renovation of the existing school to the extent that's feasible. Right? We're going to be looking at potentially a renovation addition as well as new construction options. When we look at the middle high school, okay, we're really looking at a renovation addition, okay, in terms of being able to renovate one of those buildings. Obviously, it's going to need to be expanded, so we wouldn't have a strict reno only. And then we'll also be looking at a new construction option there as well. So again, looking at the module number 3 and where we are right now, or leading towards right now, we're going to be doing a preliminary design program submission, okay, in March, where what we'll be doing is providing the overview of the educational program, which has been developed by the district. We're going to go through the educational space summaries, which is a room-by-room accounting of what the size is of each room and what all those various rooms are, so we know how big the building is and how we're going to be putting all of those different pieces and parts of the building together. And then we're going to be developing the options, as I mentioned before. And ultimately, we're going to take all of those options and boil them down to a few. Similarly, when we get to the preferred schematic report submission, okay, which we're going to be doing in May, we'll be taking that and further refining that down, okay, to where we ultimately end up with a preferred option that we can move forward into schematic design, do that more detailed review, and be able to develop a cost for that. And this is just a graphic really explaining the same things that I just talked about there. Many options, boiling down to a few options in the PDP, then taking those few options, refining those, and bringing that down to where we have one option that we move forward. And I guess one thing to remember here is that while we're going and doing an awful lot of research, what we're talking about right now is we're not making a final decision today. Okay, we're starting to take that and refine those down. We won't actually be making a final decision until we get to that point where the schematic design has been completed, and ultimately that's been submitted to the MSBA and approved by the MSBA. So it is a process. It's a process that's done throughout the Commonwealth, and there's been a tremendous amount of success in being able to get these types of projects completed. Here again, we're talking about the schematic design. We're really starting to boil that down, getting into a lot of detail now in how we put that from a technical architecture perspective. We're able to really refine that and get it to a point where we can do accurate cost estimates. We'll be able to understand exactly, what that building is, how big that building is, and ultimately what that building is going to be able to look like. So with this, does anybody have any questions at this point? There's a number of different things that we're going to go through, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about it at the end of the presentation. But if anybody has anything right now, more than happy to address those, or we can pick these up at the end. Yep.
How much experience does your firm have in going through this process?
Quite a bit. I think over the past 10 years, I think that we've done somewhere around 5 million square feet of new school projects. So it's quite a bit over that period of time. We're working locally. We're working over in Triton. We're doing the new elementary school there. We did Wilmington High School. We did North Reading Middle High School. So we actually have quite a bit of experience. We have about 50 people in our firm, and that is what we do. About 85% of our practice is focused on educational design, and about 90% of that is public education in Massachusetts. Good question. Anyone else? Yeah.
On occupancy numbers?
Yeah.
Are those like max? Like what if like some huge development came in at some point and there was a high surge of students, can it accommodate more than what was presented, or how does that work?
Well, it doesn't change the enrollment projection today with what the agreement has been with or is with MSBA. However, there are some abilities to be able to accommodate some of that additional growth. Jason will talk a little bit about that in terms of what we talked about is the utilization factor. And I think that depending upon how the school operates, or comparing how the school operates today, to be able to be even more efficient down the road, there's opportunities to do that which would accommodate some of that growth. We would also look at trying to put the building together so that there's an opportunity perhaps for some expansion. The site, the existing high school, middle school site feels big, but when you look at the wetlands and the existing buildings there's not as much flexibility as you might think. But we're going to do our best job in terms of being able to maybe to accommodate some growth if something like that happens. Another good question.
And those are, as you said, agreed moments with the MSBA. They're the basis of an MSBA formula that helps develop the spaces. So it's not the quote maximum capacity of the building, it's just the numbers that we use to develop a full space center.
Right, and that's based on what the district's student-teacher ratio is. And so, there's always a little bit of opportunity to wiggle there. But that's the deal, right, that's been made so far, or it's done.
To add on to our question, you guys go to the town planning boards, ask them to attend your forecast.
When you look at future build-out, some of those factors are factored into what's going on, as well as the cohort survival method is what they do to use to help develop some of those enrollment projections. So yeah, that's looked at, and you know, I live in West Newbury. So when I first looked at those numbers, I said, you know, that seems odd, you know, that there's that many students there today and that we're looking at that type of drop. But when you look at, you know, kind of what the trend has been, you know, it starts to justify itself. And the other answer is there's not too much you can do about it in terms of making the deal with the state. I mean, that's been agreed upon, and there's really no turning back. So now that's what we've done. That's you know what's been done, and it's our job now to make sure that we can accommodate that, as well as looking at potential need for some flexibility. You know, if things change. You know, if all of a sudden, you know, there was 100% build out in Groveland, you know, well, that's kind of a different situation. You know, we're following, you know, kind of what the statistics lead us to believe, and not something outside of that.
Is considered the school choice numbers also?
Yeah, that's also included. Jeff?
I just wondered if I could add to that process.
Sure.
So I'm going to expand on that discussion that we had with the state. So the state, when they do their enrollment projection, they come forward with a number based upon lots of different formulas that they use. And then they invited us in to have a discussion with them to see if there was some other convincing argument that we could present that would get them to boost the number up. And we did that. So they came in with a lower number than is presented here, and then we went in to have a discussion with them, and as a result of that, they were able to boost it up a little bit. So we feel pretty good about having a little bit of a cushion based upon our conversation with them. But I did have a question, Brad.
Yeah.
I wondered if maybe you could explain a little bit about all of these different options. Like, why are you doing all of these different options? And is that part of the MSBA process? Or?
We're just a glutton for punishment. No, as I was saying, I think we've got a couple slides back here.
Yeah.
The MSBA requires, okay, that we go through this process to evaluate the renovation addition, or the new construction option. So when we look at that with two different schools, or two different school concepts between, you know, a middle high school and a high school, we know here we would have a minimum of 5 options, right? And then when we look at that, we're also looking at, you know, what other potential opportunities do we have throughout the site to locate one of these buildings. And we might put it together a different way. So there's different permutations on each one of those. And so our job now, working with the working group and the building committee, is to be able to go and start to narrow that down to the few options, right, until we get to the one option. So, you know, we may end up with a universe of maybe 15 or 20 options, but we want to boil that down pretty quick. And some of those will become very evident right away when you look at what the constraints are on the site. Mike?
When do you get to that? When do you get to the point where it's either going to be new construction? I know you set the timeline, but now that I saw this slide, when do you get to the point where you come down to the final option?
Pretty soon. So right now, where we are, we're not in a position to present it tonight. But what we've been doing is we've been working through some of the visioning sessions, you know, to give us some direction. We understand, you know, what the space summary or what the space requirement is based on those visioning sessions and working with the district. We're refining that now, and we're doing some of those truth tests internal to our firm to be able to understand how we might organize the building and how that organization might work at different locations on the site. Ultimately, we're going to take those and see, you know, what ones seem to make sense, what ones don't. And when we start to refine that down further, we're going to start to do some, you know, higher level cost estimates, comparative, to understand, you know, are there not only maybe some programmatic educational benefits of one versus the other, but also to look at what the cost differences are in some of those, so we can make some of those value decisions. Does that make sense? Yes.
In my understanding by this, that the footprint of the existing buildings is large enough to accommodate future needs?
That's correct. Of the two existing buildings.
We'll talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, before we got in, when we looked at what, there was an assessment that was done prior to our coming in, and the building was actually, it was suggested that it was much larger, but we actually went out as part of our existing conditions review and actually measured every space. So, we have, a high level of confidence in terms of the accuracy that we have today, and what we're representing here. So, yeah, it's today, and we're going to get, as John said, we're going to get into a little bit more detail, actually a fair amount of detail later in the presentation. Okay, so, go ahead.
You mentioned earlier there's a state reimbursement between 40 and 50%.
Yeah, it's actually between 40 technically and 90, but I know we're not going to be on the 90. We're going to be closer to 40, just based on demographics.
Because that's a big spread, between 40 and 50%.
It is.
For the 3 towns.
It is. But it's all based on the demographic, and then one step further, it's reimbursed on eligible costs. And that's a really important distinction, because somebody might say, I'm going to give you 50% back, right? And it's different when I say I'm going to give you 50% back on eligible. And so there's kind of some of these other nuanced things, and you can read up on this on their website, but there's some kind of caps that are out there, on construction costs, for example. Some spaces are reimbursable, some spaces are not. And Jason's going to get into that in the space summary. So the state might dictate that you get 10 square feet for this space, but based on the discussions we've had, it seems in Pentucket we might need 15 square feet based on how we want to go and teach our kids for whatever reason. That additional 5 square feet may not be eligible for reimbursement, so that's a full freight item.
Does the reimbursement for renovation also?
It does. It does. Okay? So I'm going to turn this over to John next, and he's going to go through the next section of the presentation.
Yeah, just to wrap up on more about the reimbursement, but really it's like have a specific.
That's the whole line.
You can't predict who the analysis is going to go spreadsheet or the so that's what we're doing.
John.
So one part of the first process of the feasibility study was a physical assessment of the existing buildings. We had teams of engineers and our architects. come
John?
out and look at the building.
You want to try using one of the microphones? You have a very nice voice. Are they both? No? They should
It was
be.
on.
No, I'm not hearing it. Try one of the other ones. It's supposed to be live.
Is it just to the...
No, there's big speakers right there. I'll go through it. That will work, huh?
This one.
There you go. We got one.
So in October or so, we had teams of our engineers, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, civil, structural, as well as architects, come out and assess both the middle school and the high school, evaluate them compared to existing codes. It was really the challenge to establish what would be needed to do to the buildings to make them function for another 50 years. That's our mandate with any of these options, whether it's renovation only, renovation addition, or new construction, is to give the District of Pentucket a 50-year solution.
Yeah, you pushed a bunch of crazy buttons.
So we have detailed assessments that we will submit to the MSBA. They'll be available for public viewing as well. If you don't want to read 200 pages of engineering writing, this is a really quick summary of that in a kind of consumer reports format. A clear circle would be excellent, a half blue circle would be very good, an all blue circle would be good, half blue, half black would be fair, and all black is poor. So just as a quick glance, you can see the existing buildings are not excellent. There's a fair amount of work in all of them. The high school, which was built in the late 50s, is a little worse than the middle school, but both of them have a substantial amount of work needed just to really bring them up to existing code and to make them useful for the next 50 years. Middle school just turned 50 last year, so, We've summarized this before in public meetings, but there's, as you probably all know, there's been a number of issues, ongoing issues with maintenance facilities, whether it's water leaks, gas leaks, the electrical service explosion. So, you know, the building's infrastructure, especially its MEP, is really showing its age and needs to be completely replaced, both to meet current standards and for long-term functionality. If you want to talk more about that, we can, but...
Could you just define what MEP
Oh,
is?
sure. Mechanical, electrical, and plumbing.
Okay.
That is fire protection is, you know, use their acronym. They're part of that scope. And that's a fairly high proportion of the construction costs to look at either renovation or new construction. So not only is instrumental to how you use the building, but it's instrumental to the cost of making it useful. So that's a brief summary of the physical assessments. The other portion I was going to talk to you about is the sizing, and this is related to MSBA standards. MSBA has two types of standards. They have a per room categorization, so they have a certain range that general classroom should be, a range that high school science classroom should be. They have a formula based on agreed enrollment for what the size of an auditorium or a cafeteria. So what we've done here is we've analyzed the existing individual rooms based on the MSBA standards for that room type. Red would be undersized, less than 10% or more below MSBA standards for that room type. Yellow would be within 10%, either above or below of the MSBA standards, and the green would be higher, larger than the MSBA standards. Since these buildings were built, even with the additions well before the MSBA came into existence, they weren't built according to MSBA guidelines. So as you can see, some spaces are smaller and some spaces are larger than the MSBA standards. On the lower floor here of the high school, you can see it's generally good. There's some classrooms in the newer wing that are undersized, and the gym by MSBA standards is undersized. If you look at the main level, you can see again a lot of classrooms on a per classroom basis are undersized compared to MSBA standards. The auditorium is actually relatively close to their standards. This is based on the agreed upon enrollment for high school only, not your actual current enrollment, which as we said before is high. Because I know you've heard that the auditorium is too small. So, especially classrooms, you can see there's a lot of undersized classrooms by NSBA standards, and Jason will talk a little bit in visioning and educational programming, but on that side, the trends in school design is to have more space in a classroom to allow more flexibility in teaching. Everyone doesn't sit in a row and have a teacher lecture anymore. There's a lot of different activities that need to happen in the classroom, a lot of small group work and space that's required, so you need a larger classroom than you did when we were in school. The middle school is similar, a little bit better, in that you see some more yellows, but there's still an awful lot of classrooms that are undersized by, in this case, middle school classroom standards. Just from an efficiency point of view, the middle school is an all one-story building that takes up a lot more footprint. So when we develop our options, we're going to mostly look at two-story solutions and three-story solutions. Yes?
Are the rooms undersized, or were they built for smaller class sizes?
I would say they were built for different standards.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The numbers of students that they would put in these classrooms when these buildings were built were probably far higher than what we would typically put in a classroom today. Say 30 students per classroom versus 23 students per classroom. And as John was alluding to, what that does is significantly limits the instructional flexibility of the teacher or the learning activity the students are engaged in, the more we put in them.
I'm saying all those brown boxes could change to green if you reduce the class size. Yes, and you've got room, all the places that are green could take up more class size classrooms. So it's kind of a misleading thing to see all the brown and say they're undersized when the class size would affect if they're undersized.
That's a fair statement, but we performed this analysis based on what the MSBA guidelines are for space, and they have two components. They have a square footage component, and they have a students per class component. And so you're absolutely right. You can fit 12 kids in a 600 square foot classroom, and you can fit 30 kids in a 1,000 square foot classroom. But the MSBA guidelines aren't organized that way.
So what is the class size the state says we should have
23
for all grades?
for all, well, for
Middle school.
7 through 12. That's the assumption.
The other thing too, along the same line that you're thinking is, if you were to go down to 12, just using that number, to make those right size, you also have to add more teachers, right?
And more spaces.
And more spaces.
Yeah, but you've got green to get more spaces.
Right, it's still been happening for 3 too.
I know that, but they're oversized. Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah,
So you have more space.
that's correct.
Just, I think I heard you say this, but, so you're saying, it says from 7 through 12 would be the same teacher-student ratio, or would it flex between 7th and 8th or 9 through 12? So if we went to a combined, high school, middle school, would we need different size classrooms and on the grade? Or is it one for all? 'Cause I know some kids go between the two schools now, so does that?
Ultimately, this will be a district decision what the relationship is between teachers and students. And we have to be careful not to equate that with students in space.
Just wonder what the state guidelines.
Right, so
Consistent or-
the state's students per classroom guideline is the same for grades 7 through 12.
Yep.
Right, and it's 23. It varies when we get down into the elementary grades. But, right, this is one method, this is one kind of analysis, and we're basing on what the MSBA says, not necessarily what the district's going to actually
That's
execute.
fine, that's why I was just curious what the state was saying, should the guidelines be the same second as well?
Right, and then this is a guideline for space usage. Every district has a different student-teacher ratio based on a whole number of issues. So that was a room-by-room analysis, but we also wanted to talk about total gross square footage, as was pointed out earlier, right? So some of the rooms, many of the rooms are undersized, some of the rooms are oversized, but the buildings as a whole, there's also a gross square foot per student metric that the MSBA has. And by that measure, the existing buildings are larger than they would be if constructed now according to the MSBA standards.
If they were constructed for the proposed enrollment, yes.
Yeah,
Correct.
the proposed enrollment.
The key takeaway there is that we're likely to end up, if we execute a new building project for grades 7 through 12, right, we're likely to end up with a building that's physically smaller than what we have today. And you can understand why that is, because we have fewer kids, right, than we have today. And we're going to be more efficient with how we use space than perhaps we are today.
And if for some reason, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but if we had a renovation option that say it just renovated and used the complete footprint, maybe we changed some interior divisions, but the overall gross square footage remained as it is, a certain portion of that would be ineligible because it would be over the allowable area.
No, that's not necessarily the case. We actually are experiencing this just down the road in Raleigh, where they have a building that is 90,000 square feet, and if we were building it, it would be 60,000 square feet, but the MSBA is fully participating in renovating all of that existing square footage.
In a renovation.
In a renovation only.
But if we were doing an addition or a new construction to try to match the existing square footage, I guess that's what I was thinking.
Right, that would right, we would have to ask the MSBA, but that would probably just not ever be allowed. You couldn't simply replicate what you have today, because it would far exceed their guidelines for a project of this size.
So this is exactly why we look at all of these different options. Because in one option, let's say if we were doing a new construction option, that new construction option, if you look at that number right there, might be somewhere around $190,000. That'd be great. 190,000 square feet.
Start building
If we were to do a reno, okay, we would be renovating significantly more than that. Because we can't just go and reno, part of it, and not reno the whole building. So we have to look at, overall, what's the best educationally, and what is the best, in terms of, or looking at cost, so we can make that value decision that I was talking about before. And we also have to look at what the conditions of these buildings are, because sometimes, we say, well, we can just renovate that. But one of the things that we found out, okay, is there are a lot of significant issues that are going on with these buildings.
So whether it's a middle school, high school, combined school, maybe separate but one new structure, or whether it's a high school only, there's different standards. So you can see here that the combined total of the two schools as existing is $263,000. New construction, new standards. One metric would be $240,000. Another metric, because MSBA has two different metrics, one for high school, one for middle school. They don't have a middle high school formula, so it is $189,000. We also have to look at a high school, only option.
There's two possible techniques to size an MSBA project for your population. One is look at every kid as if they're high school kids, even though it's grades 7 through 12. And the other is look at them as two freestanding things that we've simply stitched together. And that's the difference between that $215,000 square foot number and that 190,000 square foot number.
You mentioned that it's the same metrics, right? 23 kids per class. So what's the delta between the middle school and the high school? What's the delta?
So there's literally two different Excel spreadsheet tabs. One for middle school with its own set of formulas built off of the green enrollment, and one for high school off of that enrollment.
So
you take the total 965, put it at the bottom of the high school tab. That's what Jason's saying. That would be the smaller number. Because of the way the formula works. Or you could run the tab for middle school students on the middle school spreadsheet and the high school population on the high school spreadsheet, even if it's combined school.
What makes that decision? It's going to be 189.
Ultimately,
this plus some other factors are in discussion with the MSBA.
Yeah. Ultimately, they get to decide. We're going to make a proposal based on what we think is appropriate to serve the education that's taking place, and then the MSBA will weigh in on whether or not they agree to that or not.
And that is the when we say PDP, preliminary design program, that is this first step of the feasibility process, is to establish the educational as well as the physical needs and make some initial recommendations, including our interpretation based on that of the MSBA formulas. And then the discussion begins. So I'm sure that's clear as much.
The only other thing we wanted to point out here is that district offices are on campus, and the discussions about what to do about district offices continues. But as of tonight, the district offices are not part of the project, and they're expected to stay in that portion of the middle school, even if we knock the rest of it down. So that's still under discussion, still in development, but that's where we are as of tonight.
And part of the logic is district offices are ineligible costs. So if a district does build or renovate a district office, all those costs related to the district office are deemed ineligible by the MSBA. So they could do a project, but they're not going to participate in the percentage reimbursement of that. Are there more questions about assessments?
Is it okay if I don't use the microphone? People hear me okay if I put my teacher voice on? So we've engaged an awful lot of folks already in the discussion to help define what this project is. Obviously, that's why you're here tonight as well. The two big things we've done is we've had, as Brad mentioned, 3 public visioning sessions, and we've engaged an awful lot of the middle school and high school users, teachers, faculty, staff, students, as part of the process. And we want to share some of those outcomes with you tonight because they have helped shape where the project is to date. In visioning session number 1, the agenda is actually over here on the left. We talked at a very high level about education. how the world and how education has changed since these buildings were built, and a lot has actually happened in the 50 or so years. We also talked about how the district plans to educate children moving forward. As many of you are probably aware, over the last 5 years or so, the district has already made some educational shifts at the middle school and high school level. Things like emphasizing student choice, right? Giving them a broader selection of courses that they can take. Organizing courses in a different way than they had before. Emphasizing, authentic learning, experiential learning. So all of those things came out as part of visioning session number 1. We also asked those in attendance how they would define the goals and objectives of the project in a general sense. And I'll share with you those results there in the second bullet list. And then finally, we tried to give folks some sense of how buildings were being designed today to support 21st century teaching and learning. And while you can't cover a tremendous amount of ground in a 3 or 4 hour session, we tried to give everybody a sense of what a 21st century building looks and feels like from a design point of view. So we listed specifically in the list below some of what those goals and objectives were that people mentioned coming out of that first visioning session, and we tried to embody those in the rest of our presentation as we move forward. Things like making sure the process is inclusive and transparent. Is that me or is that someone else? Is that you? You're causing all kinds of problems.
Someone's eating Rice Krispies.
Ultimately, folks in attendance that day want the project to be successful. They want the vote to pass, right? And that was very clear in the comments that they made. They wanted the project to be student-centric. What do we mean by that? When I went to school, the building I went to high school in, it was everybody faced the front. The teacher stood there. All of the design decisions were about the teacher. What's effective for the teacher? So what we heard was sort of turn that around. When you're making design decisions, make sure you're thinking about the students first. Obviously, there's a wide variety of things that we have to think about when we're designing a school, but ensure that we put students front and center in that process. Similarly, this is going to be the largest physical project these 3 towns probably ever undertake. And so it has to be the center of the community as well. And it has to be positioned in a way to be usable by the community pretty much all the time. We have a group that expressed the desire for the building to be energy efficient and sustainable. And then finally, we have to be able to afford it. So whatever the project proposal is, it has to be cost effective, which means high value for as little dollars as possible. And so we're trying to carry those sentiments forward throughout our whole process. In visioning session number 2, we talked about 3 main things, the first of which was grade configuration. Brad mentioned that there's 2 agreed upon enrollments with the MSBA, and overwhelmingly those in attendance that night preferred the 7 through 12 scenario. There was a sense that, again, if we go back to that value statement, the 3 towns would be getting more for their money if we address both of these buildings at the same time. But there was a caveat, and that's what's down here at the bottom of the screen. While people were in support of the larger grade configuration, there was a clear sentiment to create separation between middle school spaces and high school spaces, and perhaps achieve some economies of scale by having them share core facilities like the cafeteria or the auditorium or the gymnasium, the library. So separate with shared facilities, perhaps even going so far as maybe there's 2 front doors, 2 separate identities for each of these populations. The district undertook a parallel process to discuss the idea of grade configuration and other issues even further. And I'd like to ask Dr. McQueen to chime in here with some of the outcomes from that thought exchange process.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the first good piece of news is that 226 people participated, and we had lots of participation. So ultimately, 6,000 contributions were made during this process. So we feel really good about that part. And the other good part was there was nothing earth-shattering that came from this engagement. So everything Jason just went over with you is listed up here. So after all of that churning over of ideas and good thinking, it came up that, well, we really like the 7 through 12 option, but we want to make sure that you honor both the middle schoolers and the high schoolers for their identity. We want you to meet their individual learning needs, and we want you to use the common learning spaces when it makes sense, keeping the population separate for most of the time. We also are very keen on a funding formula that's very cost efficient. So as you keep hearing over and over again, we're looking at lots of ideas, lots of options, and we're going to narrow that down to what makes sense for us. In the discussion, there were some opportunities that folks focused on. One of those is to make sure we have state-of-the-art arts and athletics facilities, not just focused on academics, although that's very important to our community. We also want state-of-the-art technology, and we want those curriculum opportunities that will accelerate learning for every individual that's ready for it. So rather than having strict grade-by-grade configuration, they want, as we have right now, the opportunity for some students to accelerate when it makes sense. So it was really great because everybody sort of coalesced around some similar thinking, although there were lots of different ideas that were represented during the process.
And just to be clear how that's going to manifest itself as we move forward, we're going to try to narrow the options to as few as we can in this first submission, but the MSBA is likely to require us to carry both grade configurations, at least one of each grade configuration, into the next step. So even though this is the consensus at the moment, it's fairly likely that the MSBA is going to make us do more due diligence even on the high school only option in the next step. Envisioning session number 2, the second thing that we did was some conceptual design work around the overall building diagram. So we gave people a bunch of pieces and parts, and we said if you had your designer hat on, how would you arrange those pieces for this project? And by and large, people focused on the 7 through 12 grade configuration, and this was a really fun activity to watch people do, and it really provided meaningful feedback to the design team. But the big takeaway from that work corroborated that sense of separate middle school, high school with shared stuff in the middle. And I'll just quickly highlight, this was one of the tables work, and what you're seeing here is gymnasium stuff, cafeteria stuff, auditorium, band, art, and what you see radiating off here are classrooms, high school on one side and middle school classrooms on the other side. So we're trying to take those principles that people came up with in the visioning session and again move those forward in the design process. The last thing we did in visioning session number 3 was we established a sort of high-level set of guiding principles for design. And I won't go through these in detail, but there's some really interesting things that we should focus on. Cost effectiveness, right? The money thing is very important. We all hear that loud and clear. The idea of flexibility and fluidity of space. We know that this building is going to be in existence for 50 years, maybe even more. And what we're going to do on opening day is certainly not going to be what we're going to be doing, 25 years into the project life cycle. So there has to be enough flexibility built in so that the district and the towns can change their mind without tearing everything down and starting back over again. We talked about that it needs to be the epicenter of community activity. We'll see how that's manifested itself in the overall building diagram in just a minute. And then there's a whole host of things that are worth talking about as well. Things like self-respect, self-reflection, and respect. We haven't heard those things in very many projects, but self-reflection is this idea that there needs to be places to decompress, both for teachers and for students. And that may mean trying to create breakout spaces where students aren't sitting at a tabletop or perhaps sitting in some other kind of learning environment. Respect, allowing students to move about the building without the sense that they're doing something wrong or always being watched. That can take a lot of different forms. We mentioned sustainability, and then finally the idea of site amenities. Dr. McQueen talked about athletics and PE. We know that's very important here. So how can we position the project on the site to maximize those kinds of amenities? Finally, envisioning session number 3, we drilled in a little deeper. We asked tabletops to think about individual groups of spaces, things like the music conservatory. What kinds of spaces should they be next to each other? What kinds of activities are happening inside those spaces? So you can see the one on the left, I think, is the library, and this one is the athletics one, where there's lots of fields scattered on both sides of the campus. I mentioned user groups. We also met with this group of folks, and actually next week we have a student workshop where we're going to do the same kind of thing. We did a similar conceptual design activity with these guys, where we were actually drawing concepts for what individual groups of places might be, so that we could size them properly and ultimately locate them properly in each of our options. Any questions about the visioning process? Yes, sir.
When doing that exercise, how would it be possible for someone to suggest multiple floors? It looks like everything's flat.
Good question. So, in order to make the exercise as user-friendly as possible, we only work on a flat surface. But to use this table's work as an example, we as the design team could imagine that this is on the ground, but all of this is picked up and folded over and stacked on top of that, right? Or this side is a 3-story, 1 arm, and this side is a 3-story, 1 arm. So we have the ability to synthesize that work and speculate is this a 2-story concept or is this a 3-story concept, so that it fits on the site better. Does that answer your question?
It does, but that would also give you the potential, which you thought was limited, to expand and add in the future.
Exactly. So if for example, we ended up with 1 3-story arm, perhaps in the future we could have another 3-story arm for expansion possibility. That's the future. Other questions about the visioning effort?
I think you came to visioning. I see some lot of familiar faces.
Got some hands.
So I'll turn it back over to John to talk about the space summary.
So as Jason said, the MSBA has approved 2 design enrollments for this project, and so these are showing gross summaries of those 2 enrollments. There's a high school only enrollment of 605 students, which has been displayed using that MSBA high school tab in their spreadsheet would be 167,000 gross square feet. Whereas your
Yeah, that's right.
That should be 7.
It is, and I apologize, we have that typo in all of the slides that have this big circle. That is a 7 as well. Yeah, that's right.
But the existing high school is 147,000?
It is.
Square feet?
It is, correct.
So the high school is actually smaller, right?
Yeah, and let me clarify that. So if we were to build exactly what the MSBA suggests is necessary for your high school only population, it would actually be smaller than your existing building. But this...
larger.
Nope.
No?
So the MSBA, if we went all the way back to here, right, the MSBA suggests that a high school population of 605 only needs a 140,000 square foot building. You have 147,000 square feet here to take now. But once we apply the district's educational model, right, it generates the need for a slightly larger building than what we've got today, even though the enrollment is declining a little bit. Okay.
Right, so we've actually, the discrepancy I was studying, we've baked in some unique needs. We're talking to the visioning group, we're talking to the administrator, we're talking about some of the spaces that are necessary to say to support the utilization rate that Kentucky has. MSBA, one of their metrics, they have a lot of metrics. So they expect a school classroom to be used 85% of the time. Most districts, a lot of districts have 7 periods per day, and they use regular classrooms 5 times out of 7. And the other 2, one is lunch and one is a special. And with a homeroom basis or with a teacher owning a classroom, that means a classroom sits empty. that generates a 71% utilization. That's the standard in Pawtucket, as with a lot of districts. And so these numbers have baked that in so you can continue to operate the new school the way you operate the current school.
Correct, and it's the technique that Brad was talking about before, how we're building in a little bit of growth capacity in the project. Right, if we're only occupying classrooms 5 of 7 periods per day, given the expected daily schedule, if the district were to make a change to a 6 of 7 periods per day, then we're occupying spaces more efficiently. We could squeeze in a few more children. And so that difference in the utilization rate helps us build in a little bit of that growth capacity.
And then in addition, there's particular spaces that's come out of the user group meetings, especially to support innovation schools, academies, and some additional spaces that we're recommending. We'll have to negotiate with the MSBA. But generally, our feeling has been, based on other projects, that the core academic spaces, the MSBA is being the unique aspects of a district. They are less interested in the unique aspects of a district's athletic program or their auditorium. They particularly focus on those two as very expensive per square foot basis spaces. So that might be, or those might be spaces where we ask for something and they determine a certain amount of square footage is ineligible. In other words, totally on the district.
So where we've landed, if we talk about the 7 through 12 model, and these continue to be works in progress. We haven't submitted anything to the MSBA yet. But where we've landed for the 7 through 12 model has all of the spaces that the district thinks are appropriate. So when John mentions auditorium, we have an appropriately sized auditorium in this project. We have an appropriately sized gymnasium space to serve health and PE, even if they don't precisely align with the MSBA guidelines. And we'll have to wait to see what the MSBA says about those. An example of that is coming out of visioning. We heard from a number of stakeholders the desire for an elevated track, right? An indoor running track that's sort of suspended inside the upper volume of the gym. So the square footage associated with that is in this 234,000 square foot number. Everybody felt it was a value-added item to the project, even though everybody understands that that's going to be deemed ineligible for reimbursement. So the district may proceed with that if the MSB allows it. So we're carrying that stuff in the project for right now. Yes, sir.
What do you deem as an appropriate size auditorium? I'm asking the question with keeping graduation in mind and having every student that the student parents attend to hold that on a rainy day.
Yeah, good question. So let me start that response by telling you what the MSBA guideline is and then what we're carrying in the project at the moment. So the MSBA guideline is middle school students don't get an auditorium. Right? That's just their point of departure. So you actually have one at the middle school now, and that helps our case for including them in the arithmetic besides the auditorium. But if we were to build a new middle school from scratch, there would be no auditorium. For high school students, the algorithm is 2/3 of the agreed upon enrollment or 750, whichever is less. So we have a high school population of 605 as the agreed upon enrollment. So the size of the auditorium would seat roughly 400 kids, 400 people. That's actually a little less than what we have right now. So in working through the priorities with the working group and the vision folks, what we're carrying in the project is an auditorium that will seat just over 600. Right? The idea there is that we could seat both the entire high school population in that auditorium or the entire middle school population with some visitors and guests. But we didn't take the step of having a 1,000-seat auditorium to try to host graduation in that space on a rainy day. So we looked for this sort of compromise, this middle ground, in order to keep the project size down.
And one other marker that we have up there, just from a community use perspective, is some of you probably had attended the elementary school band or everything that happened at the high school not too long ago. I think it was actually the same time we did music session number 3.
Right.
And what ended up happening there, when you look at it from all of the elementary schools across the district, we were actually a little short. We were short by, I think, kind of a rough head count of about 120, 125 people. benchmarks that, Jason had mentioned, but we're also kind of looking at it because we know that it's not just high school, okay, and middle school. It's a 24/7 building, that's operating throughout, the entire district, and other opportunities are going to be there for community use, and similarly at the elementary school.
Yeah.
When you talk about, so the same example, you want to build another 600 people, but we decide we want to send them. That just means the cost of that extra 100 seats, all the square foot that goes with it, would be at 100% on the district, but the still cost of the 605 seats would be 50/50.
Yes, sort of. So,
In concept, yes, anything that's over the MSBA guideline will be full freight line 3 times. The caveat is, the MSBA has a fairly new policy about this kind of move, and it applies to auditoriums and gymnasia. There's I don't know what I want to call it, a penalty, but there's an additional factor in their algorithm for that. So if they were to simply say it's ineligible, right, they wouldn't be contributing their $337 a square foot to the construction cost for that space. Instead of that, they're saying, we're going to deem the full project cost, whatever it is, associated with that additional square footage ineligible. So there's a little bit of disincentive to go over the MSBA guidelines in that case. So yes, that's all still on the town's dime, but it's going to be a little more than just deeming it ineligible for reimbursement. Does that make sense?
It doesn't make sense for the
Yes.
You use the term gym in a singular form. Technically, between the high school and middle school, technically 3 gyms, right?
You do?
And so, is there an MSBA standard of what the gym space is, or the amount of gyms?
There is.
What would that be?
So the existing high school gym is around 7,000 square feet, the big gym. The little gym is around half of that size. So at the high school currently, you have about 10,000 square feet, give or take, of gymnasium space. The MSBA guideline, if we don't exceed it, is 12,000 square feet of a single gymnasium, right? And there's all kinds of techniques you can use to subdivide that for PE.
For high school.
For high school, right? The guideline for middle school is 6,000 square feet. And I actually don't know off the top of my head what the size of the middle school gym is. But what we're proposing, at least at present in that 234,000 square feet, is a 15,000 square foot main gym. Plenty large enough to have competition basketball running in 2 directions and some bleacher seating to serve, we don't have a number yet, but a significant number of spectators so that you could host an athletic event, tournament event in that space. In addition to that, we're proposing a dance space, a multi-purpose movement studio that will support the academic instruction in that category and things like fitness for athletic teams after school, and a dance space. So it's not just the one big gymnasium, it's several spaces to serve the health and PE program and athletics after school.
And that larger gym would be subdividable. That's very similar to what we've done in North Reading. So it's actually curtains, would be curtains in it. It could be 4 gyms for 4 separate PE classes that could happen simultaneously. You could have middle school on one side, high school on the other side.
I had the opportunity of visioning session number 3, okay, to sit with the athletic group. So it was hashed out in a tremendous amount of detail in terms of what the objectives were, in terms of practical use, competition use, health and PE use, all of those types of things. And I think, where we landed with this type of approach, I think was satisfactory to everybody there. And I think that while, when we look at spaces that you currently have, and you think in an aggregate square footage number, it might be different, it might be a little bit larger, right? But the opportunity for consolidating these spaces and making them more workable, functional, I think is going to significantly improve this space if we're successful in getting to that point with the MSBA. And because we do know coming out of the gate that it doesn't currently jive with what the MSBA state guidelines are, that, what comes out of that negotiation is going to probably end up in something where there's going to be some full freight associated with this part of the program. And that is part of the value decision, that we have to make here with respect to athletics PD. It's kind of a value decision that we're going to have to make, okay, with respect to, auditorium space, drama, and some types of things there. And that's not unique, right? All districts across the Commonwealth are going through the same type of analysis and ultimately have to make these types of value decisions. Because there are very few, I don't think there's any that I personally worked on where all of a sudden it completely jives with what that guideline is. It just doesn't happen. It's very unusual. Because every district's different. So those guidelines are set up to kind of give people that, a guideline, but there's going to be variation.
Other questions about the, yeah.
Hamilton Wenham had a chance to answer this same question. They did it simply with a T. And the top of the T was a smaller middle school gym, and the stem was a absolutely gorgeous high school gym. And it's separated so that now, simultaneously, they're able to run middle school phys ed at the same time as high school phys ed without any interference.
That's similar to what we were talking.
Other questions about the space summary? Oh, yes, sorry.
The opportunity for revenue factor into the allowance, like a larger gym, you could book a 500-person recital or something that has nothing to do with.
Yes, did everybody hear the question? Does the opportunity for revenue generation factor into the equation for how we size the gymnasium or the auditorium? And the short answer is yes with the district and the local folks, but the MSBA does not factor that into their equation, right? They unfortunately have a hard and fast rule often about these things, and then they say, yes, you can do it, but this percentage of it isn't going to.
And if you look at some of the auditoriums nearby that we've done in North Reading and Wilmington, they're professional level auditoriums with full lighting, sound systems, support music as well as dramatic events, and they do rent those out.
Yeah, they are attracting outside entities to use those spaces. Yes.
We're combining middle school, high school now, and they're having to share spaces. And that was designed about scheduling, because now you have overpower, because I'm not good. But you have more than twice as many kids in one space. And you have to try to get the luncheon, you have to try to get gym in, you have to try to get all that stuff, and you have to divisions, but still, that's a lot of kids to try to schedule 5 days, so they're not leaving at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, good, terrific question. And let me start a response to that, and then when we transition to the next section, we'll have a more thorough response. We've performed a lot of calculations. We've looked at how the district is currently using space, how many students are enrolled in each individual course, how many sections each space needs to accommodate. And one of the truth tests we run is if the gymnasium can be separated, if we have a dance room and a drama space, can we accommodate all the sections that are being taught, even when we combine middle school and high school population? And the answer to that is yes, right? We want to design a space that makes accommodate all the sections of the courses that need to be accommodated. With things like the cafeteria, you're going to see a concept for that in just a minute, that just because of how we're hoping to use the cafeteria naturally sets up into different zones, and it has been sized to have 3 seatings instead of, how many seatings do you have in lunch today?
We have 2. Middle school has 2, we have 2.
That doesn't help my argument at all. But
3 seatings is very easy to do. We had 3 seatings up until the middle of last year, and then we just shifted into 2. But
okay.
You can easily do 3 seatings over, from 11 to 12:30.
And what 3 seatings would do for you, because it would be a 6th grade span, you could have the middle school students in 1 seating and 2 seating the high school only students, and not need to have them cross over at lunchtime if you didn't want them to. So with that, we'll transition to this concept diagram. John, you want to start?
Yeah, so this is, I think, the last image we're really going to show is two images, and they're our first and second floor kind of synthesis of all we've discussed previously. So it's our user group discussions, it's our visioning especially, it's trying to make our guidelines, it's our discussions with the working group, with the building committee, and this is what we call a bubble diagram. It's not that the rooms are going to be shaped like this, and they may not be exactly in this disposition, but it's trying to generally show the groupings and the relationships of spaces. Or maybe you can point out, Jason. So as I think Jason's alluded to before, the first move is that this green student dining commons, this shared space. And we say dining commons because one of the things we've heard is it's not just a cafeteria, it's not just for one lunch period, but it's a space that's used throughout the day. And it wants to have the major core spaces open up onto it so it can serve as a lobby and a spill-out space, whether it's for the gym, for the auditorium, and the library is central but upstairs. Now we connect to it because it probably would be a two-story space. This is agnostic as to whether it's a 2- or 3-story design at this point, but generally the idea is that middle school will be on one side and high school will be on the other side, kind of wrapping around the two core spaces. First floor, though, would have the larger special spaces, so you can see around the auditorium, like the other music spaces, and then we have an art room. And then we have locker rooms and the kind of physical education spaces all in orange clustered around the gym. In this case, there's some, just to make things work, there might be some extra or some of the leftover science spaces on the back. That might be an opportunity to connect to outdoors. That was another one of our guiding principles, is to put opportunities for outdoor learning. And then the front, in this case, is two distinct but adjacent entrances, one for each school, with administration similarly mirrored in the center. So high school, middle school administration will be next to each other, but distinct, allowing for some synergies as well as their entry sequence. And then upstairs, you can see that now the blue is our coloring scheme for general classrooms. All the classrooms wrap around with high school on the left, middle school on the right in this case. The auditorium and gym are 2-story spaces anyways, and the library might be up on that second floor, opening out into the student dining commons and possibly even having a view kind of through the building out to the back, whatever the orientation of this is.
So I'll just add that because the high school is more students, we may need more floors to accommodate high school, which is why John was suggesting that perhaps the high school classrooms spill out into the lower level. The other thing I'll point out is these two marks right here. We've talked already about safety and security planning, and on this floor, those two marks are meant to indicate the separation between public and private. So in other words, in an after-hours event, you could provide access to the entire first floor and secure those classrooms and not provide access to them. And similarly, upstairs, the separation between high school and middle school could be signified with some architectural move, a set of double doors that could be, again, could be locked after hours. And we could put an object like the library at the joint between the middle school and high school so that when crossover does happen, it's happening in a supervised way. Right, this was a move that HMFH architects did quite successfully at their Winthrop Middle High School, and I think it's a project that some of you have even gone to visit. So that's what those marks are meant to represent, both the separation of public and private and where the boundaries between middle school dedicated space and high school dedicated space might be on all the floors, whether it's 2 stories or 3 stories.
Well, one important thing for people to remember too, right, when you walk away from here tonight, is that we want you to think, oh, these guys have been thinking about things. There were some things there that made sense to me. We don't want you to walk away with the notion that they have it all figured out. I saw it up on the big screen, because it's not. Right? What we're doing here, these bubble diagrams are tools for us, okay, as a design team, to be able to work through some of these higher level concepts. And really starting to explore things like what is the relationship of classrooms to the library, what happens when we start putting things in 3D, in terms of stacking, like you were speaking to earlier. you know, what the relationship is between the student dining commons and maybe the auditorium space or the gymnasium spaces, and really allows us to start thinking about that. And so there's a lot of work to do. So the idea here is we wanted, you know, you guys to be looking at this and saying, okay, I get this big picture thing that what you're talking about. But remember, right, it's going to change, right? It's going to evolve, and it's going to evolve to the better. Yes.
Are there bubble diagrams for the two separate schools, as you said several times, the parallel path will continue for a while. So are there diagrams of the two buildings if they're deemed to become separate renovation?
Yeah, in that scenario, right, it would be, if we would only be doing a high school only, so the middle school, if we determined that we were going to do a high school only project, the middle school wouldn't be touched. We'd just be working on a high school.
Okay,
So there will be, but we're not showing them all tonight, but yes, there are. Okay, where we would have that for all of those options that we do, and there's 5 up front, and then there's going to be you know, permutations on that. We'll be developing bubble diagrams for all of those.
But you don't have to.
Correct. Not tonight, not for this presentation. We can't give you it all. Right?
Literally.
You want you to come to the next one.
It's a teaser.
Yes.
You go back to that previous slide right here. So, looks like a really efficient use of, you know, shared space and space without student dining commons there. My only concern would be like, you know, an effort to sort of keep the middle school and high school separate. That looks like a common lounge area that's open all day. So is that in addition to that sort of, or is that just like a open shared space between middle and high school? And that's sort of what some concerns, I guess, the implementing between 7th and graders and 12th graders. Are they just going to be in the common space all day, intermingled, or?
A couple things about that. The concept we heard for this idea was more like collegiate student center. Right, so it wouldn't just be this, you know, lobby space with those kinds of tables in it. It would have a much wider variety of seating settings. Some soft furniture, some dining tables, perhaps some club chairs, coffee tables, that sort of thing. Because again, getting back to that theme of student voice and choice, we don't want that cafeteria space to be institutional. So yes, if we are successful in that, there is an opportunity for it to be used outside the lunch period. And so if we're successful in achieving this sort of connective tissue between the middle school and high school, with administration right at the middle, perhaps the high school kids are using this zone and the middle school kids are using that zone. And we already discussed at lunchtime, even with 3 settings, there's an opportunity for no crossover with high school students and middle school students in the same space at the same time, if that's what's desired.
Well, at the same time, right, figuring out, and that's our job, right? We want that to be able to be flexible, so that we don't just compartmentalize, you know, this is middle school dining over here, and this is high school dining over here. When we have an opportunity to open that up to where it's a much more inviting space, you know, if we'd be having a play, for example, where people would want to be able to spill out into that. So part of our design challenge is to figure out, you know, how can we break up that space so that it facilitates some level of separation so that people are comfortable, while at the same time, you know, being able to keep that so that it works for other opportunities as well.
Yes.
So kind of that same, so looking at the locker room, so I have a daughter who literally just got turned 12 when she hits the 7th grade. There is a big gap between 11 and just 12-year-old and a 12th grade, right?
Yep.
Whether it's girls and girls or boys and girls, how do we look at those locker rooms and know that there's going to be protection and security so that peer pressures and things are not imminent?
So for locker rooms, as with many of the spaces, there are 2 middle school PE locker rooms, one for boys and one for girls, and they're distinct from the high school PE locker rooms, and also the high school team rooms.
Right now there are 6 locker rooms in the project.
And so where you have those walls, they're independently, they're not one connected?
Yeah, correct.
Corridor connected,
Right.
but they're individual rooms, privacy.
But from a security perspective, you can't go from one to another, or, you know, I'm just looking at the back. I know her now, and I won't know
Yeah,
her
sure, so
longer.
for-
And she is up 17.
Whether from a micro level, like the locker room complex, let's say, or macro level, like a big dining common space, one of the, combining our kind of design guidelines and architectural intent with each other, where we have a guideline about respect and making a student-centric experience, and also providing controlled separation between those who are high school in particular. So we find the best strategy for that, either on the macro or micro level, is to have passive supervision of all open space that's undefined, and then obviously have classroom space with dedicated space. So in the case of the locker rooms, we would have the health instructors' offices located in a way, we've done some other projects, to provide that kind of passive supervision. So you don't have kids off in a corner or corridor without anyone nearby, but you don't necessarily have to have a staff member following a student all the way through.
And we'll get into all of those connection details in subsequent stages in the design process. But right now we have at least conceptually 6 distinct locker room spaces.
It looked like one, and I didn't know if they were co-connected or from the.
Yeah, please don't take that diagram literally.
No, that just.
So that there's kind of, you know, some of these things we're talking about in separation, you know, there's certain things that are going to be a high level of separation. Locker rooms is one, right? So we want to kind of allay your fears on that one, and you know, this isn't the first time that this has come up for exactly the reasons you point out.
Yeah.
So those ones are going to be broken down, right? And, you know, the supervision aspect that John mentioned, but also physical building environment. That's where to say, okay, yeah, this is where 7 and 8 is, right? And here's where 9 and 12 is, right? And that's the way it's going to be. You know, it's going to be a little bit fuzzier in some of these other areas, like when we talk about, you know, student dining commons, right? But there's still an opportunity for that to happen. That area in particular, you're going to be up.
And my only other question was, the second slide, you showed an upper student dining, is that just the seating? You're saying there's a second level to that, or is that?
A two-story space, and there might be some balcony, and also the library connects there. So you can imagine, we want to, you know, part of this diagram is it's a very compact diagram, which is sufficient for use of the overall site. And there is already, right, middle school students taking high school classes sometimes. So we want to make some controlled connection between the two schools. So that's where the library is there, right in the center. So if there was, say, a balcony running across, you would pass basically through the library. It would be an unsupervised corridor. There would be some eyes on the street.
Yeah, my question was more, I know kids that go there today, family members that literally don't have lunch because they can't get from point A to point B, get to lunch, buy lunch, and eat lunch, they just don't eat. Because of the
travel time.
Because of the travel time, so that's why I wasn't sure how
We're going to solve that.
Yes, sir.
Would students in the dining area only be allowed to be there for eating? Or is it going to be an area available for access by students who just want to walk through?
If we're successful and the district operates the building the way the visioning participants described it, then the latter. Right? The whole idea of expressing the dining commons as a student center so that it can be used outside the lunch period for students for collaborative reasons.
During the lunch period, when students are there to eat.
Yes.
And the bell rings, and it's another class period for someone else. Can they just walk through and get to where they want to go?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So supervisor walk through to the
I don't know. Think so. They, you know, all right, well, I think that this is a chance for breaking it up. I don't think that, you know, we're going to go and have a course or this is private So I think it is manageable. And I think that the use that we're projecting here is not just night. This has an opportunity, and the way that we would put this together is that it's actually for non-dining, which is those 3 periods a day, right? It's an opportunity to go and have larger groups in there, so that you do larger group learning and all of that. And we have to deal as part of the design team to figure out, you know, how the egress paths work. So we wouldn't be, you know, working right through that. We'd be working around. So, and we've seen this and we've done it successfully, okay, in other situations.
Because what happens is, it takes so much work by the school administration to manage lunch times that students inevitably wander through without making it a special event for everybody to integrate. And it causes a real problem. I've seen it happen.
We can certainly continue to explore that with our building committee and our work group. But this is the concept that's on the table at the moment, and that's what we're sharing out, our progress where we're
And these are really concepts about relationships between spaces. A lot of, I think, what we're talking about now, whether it's just specifics about detailing of individual areas, there's a lot more to that.
Any other questions about those diagrams? Unfortunately, I can't bring them back up in plastic fashion. Our bulb has burned out. Are there other questions? Yes.
Yes.
So, sustainability, next question. So yeah, so one of the things our firm takes very seriously is sustainability. We have probably done more lead projects, publication and state than I venture than anything else. So one of the things that we talked about with the building committee early on, pursue this as a lead goal project, which we found, in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, it's kind of a sweet spot. If you go to the next level, it becomes the cost-benefit relationship doesn't seem to work as well. So we will be pursuing this as a lead project under DP4. So all of those things where we can look at life cycle costs versus upfront capital costs, and be able to do that cost-benefit analysis. That's all part of what our job is here. And we actually have a specialized sustainability consultant that we retain as part of our team, in addition to our MEP engineering team, to help us through that process. Maybe. But I mean, that's this cost-benefit analysis that we want to be able to do, because we have a limited amount of money that we're going to be spending on things. And we want to be able to make sure that, is it better to go and put our eggs in that solar bucket, or is it better to go and put our eggs in a geothermal bucket? Or, look at all those. So we're going to go and look at all of those energy control measures and cost-benefit those to see what the best balance is on an overall sustainable basis.
Brad, just for those folks who don't know, can you describe what LEED is?
Yeah, so LEED is a sustainable process that's put forward by the United States Green Building Council. And really what it does is it outlines a whole number of different sustainable facets that you can incorporate into the project, ranging from, typically a lot of people think we're going to go and do a sustainable project and it's going to be really energy efficient. And that's true, we want that. But we want to be able to also go and look at things like acoustics, right? Because acoustics are important in terms of the people who have to live there. We want to look at or work there. We want to look at things like air quality. Okay, we want to go and look at all of these types of things holistically so that we can make the best decision from a sustainable perspective, as well as, an operating perspective for the students and staff that have to be in there, 8 to 10 hours, 6 to 10 hours, whatever the metric is.
Any other questions? Yes.
Well, as far as sustainability and LEED goes, for MSBA reimbursement, you have to meet the prerequisites for that, correct?
That's correct.
So if you meet the prerequisites and you can't really afford, or there isn't the heart there to go the distance, you're sort of set up to go down that road later if you wanted to, correct?
Well, you've got to go the distance in terms of getting to silver threshold level in terms of getting your reimbursement.
But as far as going the distance later, you've already gone partway there with the prerequisites, correct?
Partly, but the way LEED is structured, you need to, basically need to submit and prove you've done all the credits
Or not. Well, everybody's using this term certifiable, where it could be certified LEED at some point. It's just that capital cost that people can't get past initially, and a community gets killed by that.
A lot of communities will go out there and they say, you know what, we think, going and doing a LEED project is going to cost us more. be able to do it. So we just want to do what would otherwise going to be like a LEED certified project, but not have to necessarily go through the process. So let me tell you what happens in that scenario, right? You cheat. People go and cheat because what ends up happening, unless you have that kind of tool out there to make sure that you're following all the things that you're set up to do, and right, the MSBA requires right that you're going through and you're having a LEED. I think is it just LEED now, or is it also Massachusetts? I think it's just LEED now. But you have to go through that process in order to be eligible for those additional reimbursement funds.
And working with our consultant, and we feel confident that we can, with those 2 additional reimbursement points available, that if we achieve LEED, we can do it in a fashion, because the criteria for the 2 reimbursement points is actually LEED silver, so it's a little less than our goal. But we can achieve LEED silver through a range of strategies that's cost neutral, additional reimbursement. Now, certainly people have spent more on the E project, so the efficiency project, but that's one what Brad's talking about, going higher, going above gold, trying to go for platinum, really building a lot of solar panels. And the cost of that's gone down to in particular. So we'll look at all that with our consultant. But 20%, just in terms of energy efficiency, 20% better than code is kind of baked into that.
It's a requirement. Yeah. It's a requirement to do that. And you know, we get more points for the more we exceed both building code and a lot of the others. So, you know, kind of to sum all of this stuff up, you know, it's a good thing for a number of different reasons. It's a good thing, right, because we're going to get reimbursement for it if we do it from the state, which is basically offsetting the cost, as John was saying, of putting some of those additional measures in. It's a good thing because from a long-term operating perspective, we're putting more insulation in the building, we're putting more efficient building systems into the building, you know, lighting, and like I was saying before, from just an overall quality in terms of, you know, people working there every day, acoustics, air quality, all of those types of things. It's just a much better opportunity for people to be there all that time. And in the end, if you don't go through that process, one, MSP is not going to reimburse you, and two, like I said, we found, like, particularly with private clients, exactly like you're saying, we'll just kind of go do all that stuff, but we're actually not going to go through the process and then cheat.
Yeah. So we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Even though the screen went dead, we want to alert you to some next steps. Oh, was there another question?
Yeah, just, it seems to me that you're going to build the new integrated high school and middle school, right? Because it seems to be more fuel efficient.
Well,
Where are you going to?
all of the feedback we've received to date is pointing in that direction, but no decisions have been made yet, right? We still have to go through an evaluations process.
And what the finance forecast are we talking about?
I'm sorry?
The estimate forecast for building that?
You want to address cost estimates?
Yeah. So I can tell you this, right? And I'm a taxpayer here too, right? It's going to be by far the biggest thing that we've ever taken on, right? It's going to be expensive, right? It is. Construction is expensive, okay, in Massachusetts. So once we've gone through this and started to boil this down, right, all of that will be made available. Right? It has to be, because we've got to come to that agreement that we were talking about with the MSBA once we conclude schematic design and say, okay, this is the project that we want, and this is how much it's going to cost, and this is how much you're going to reimburse, and this is how much we're going to pay. And then once we know that, then we're going to come to all the towns and we're going to say, okay, this is it. Okay, but for right now, what we're going through all of these different options, we're going to put a comparative pricing together that's still very high level, so that we know if we're looking at new construction, right, which is going to be a smaller school, right, we talked about that earlier in space, versus having to renovate, we're doing a renovation, which is a bigger school. It might be cheaper to renovate in some instances, but there's a lot more of it. If we can build a new school, right, and it's smaller and more efficient, it might cost more because it's new, but when you balance those things out, right, it's surprising, okay, what happens. The short answer is we don't know yet because we haven't gone through that. But we're gonna be coming down the road here. But I'm telling you all right now, right? It's bigger than a bread box. I don't know. I'm not gonna give it up. Ask me again.
What else we should have done this?
That scenario, I'm going to turn over to Mr. Brett, because he's more familiar with, how these intertown relationships.
Capital projects of this nature, it is strictly on a population basis, and it will vary from year to year depending on that. Your assessment to the town will be on the same number, but will be 35.2% of that debt service one year, to be 36% the next year, depending on how the population goes.
Population of the town or population of the school?
Student population.
Student
Number of
population.
students you have in the school district, not just the school.
So we want to, yeah, go ahead.
Can you guys submit to the reimbursement percentage of 1%? There's one person who goes for 4%.
So the MSBA percentage, okay, that they've already agreed that 52.89% for this project. And so now, okay, what we don't know, eligible costs. So what we don't know yet is kind of how that eligible thing, for all of these reasons that we've discussed tonight, and what that yields is going to be our effective reimbursement rate. We just don't know that. But we do know we're starting at 52.89%, which is actually, not too bad. When I've been following this for years too, right? And I didn't think we were going to do as well as that, so I'm pleased. Well, we're going to go through when we get to the end of schematic design, right? We're going to go through it, and the MSBA has got a form for everything, right? 3011 form. Right? And that goes and takes all of the soft costs, all of the hard costs, and there's a determination made based on our discussion in eligible square footage and space and all of those things. And it all gets boiled down right there. And at that point in time, the MSBA says, we're going to support this much. And one thing they are absolutely fantastically consistent on is when they say we're going to give you $10 and we're not going to ever give you more than that, they mean it, right? The cost can go up, and there are change orders on every job, right? Because that's the way construction works. And so we build in contingencies, okay, as part of our cost projections to be able to accommodate some of those unforeseens. And then when we get into it, right? Mr. Theron here, as your owner's project manager, is going to be watching that. We, as the design team, are going to be watching that. Like I said, we already have a construction manager on board, so Rich, right? And that relationship and our ability to use that construction delivery method, I think is very, very helpful enough being able to understand what all those costs are and be able to manage the road construction.
So the other schools you work on, what are some of the things that the community decided to not get done?
Now I have.
Yes, because they put it across from
I think we've had some communities that said, we would prefer to have, more of a larger auditorium space, for example, and, pare that back. I think that, there's lots of examples in terms of spaces. Jason mentioned an elevated traffic. There's some communities, it's on the want list, and then, the need list, and that's this value decision. For example, Wellington High School, which actually John worked on, that was something that was really important to them. It wasn't eligible, but they decided they wanted to have that, and so, they took that on, and that was full great for them. And so all different communities have made these value decisions as to what's important to them. And that's when we're going to get to the eligible costs.
Two big things that get us from the starting reimbursement rate to the effective reimbursement rate is there's a cap on costs. Right? They only reimburse up to a certain percentage. And then there's always a delta between what the MSBA will reimburse in terms of construction costs and what it really is. So just those two things alone will be a fairly big chunk of the delta between the starting reimbursement rate and the effective reimbursement rate.
Like for example, you talk about the construction market today, somewhere between $450 and $500 a square foot. Typically what we're seeing out there, public construction in Massachusetts. 337, I think, is the number that's currently eligible for reimbursement. So right there, we know we've got about $160 spread in terms of what's going to be eligible, what's not. 8% is the site cap. right? We got a lot of site here, right? We're going to be doing a lot of things on that site. It's very hard to make it work within 8%. MSBA, in fairness to them, they also deal with urban communities that don't have that. So they're trying to go and balance that out from an equity basis, through all the communities.
So if we do the municipal ratios,
Yeah.
we have small and private middle school, where is that going?
So they do fund, demolition. That's included that's included in something that, that they do reimburse. And we're gonna have to look at how that all plays out with respect to district office and how that may work, right? And our objective right now is to work with the district to figure out, what works for them from an administrative, because you have to have it, right? But, what's the most cost-effective way to do that and still make it work from a site perspective?
You had a question back over there?
Yeah, right. Change order for ratio basis. What, the word change order to occur, that's not reimbursed at all, right?
No, it is. They're
Different
different.
except for the,
Some of them are reimbursed and some of them are not, right? So, for example, there's a cap, on those as well. For, architecture mistakes, you make mistakes, right? And they will result in change orders. Right, and so what ends up happening is they cover that up to 1%, right? And then you're going to have other things like unforeseen conditions, we don't know, even though we're going to be doing a lot of, geotechnical work, we don't know what happens in the ground until we dig it out, right?
So this is a second question. Typically, in your, what percentage of the contract can go to change? 4%, 5%?
So, yeah, it depends, but industry average is somewhere around 3 to 5%, right? We typically go do that. Typically, after work week on jobs that we're working on, we experience less than that. But it depends. Site, is always the toughest. It's always the toughest one. We have a lot more certainty. That doesn't mean we're done. That's the biggest wild card.
In renovation. If we're doing
renovation,
it's a whole bag of stuff. Just to, I know everyone's concerned about costs, and we heard that from the very first visioning session, and we just want to kind of maybe make something clear. So we're going to slowly, as we work through this process, which doesn't really conclude to the fall, we're going to slowly bring costs into focus. The first step is to establish what option we're actually pursuing, then we can have more information. That's what we do this spring. By May 9th, early May, we're submitting a single choice. The second step of feasibility to the MSB. In that sense, we'll know what we're pursuing, and we'll have a general sense of cost. We still don't know how the MSB is going to fully interpret that, but we'll have a good sense, because it'll be one thing we're talking about. If it wasn't clear before, the end of schematic design is unique to the MSBA strategy as opposed to the rest of the construction world, in that we have to deliver through two cost estimates, ours and the construction manager. We have to deliver total project scope and budget at the end of schematic design. It's much earlier than you would in the private world. But that is the commitment to the towns and the MSBA. That becomes the basis of the vote. So that number won't change. That number has contingency. It allows for change orders. It allows for a lot of unforeseens in the soft cost portion of it. But that total number, that total project cost number, then that the towns will be reviewing in the fall, that will be the cost of the project. So, and then that will include at that point that since we have a specific design and a specific space center, then the MSBA will be able to give us a specific interpretation of the reimbursement cost. So you'll have a total cost as well as your share.
Yes.
This might not fall in purview, but maybe it's not the area to ask it, but has there been a study done or any analysis done on the impact on housing prices, the cost of housing in communities where they got a new high school and possibly where they did not get a new high school?
On values of homes?
I'm glad you asked. I actually did some digging around, and I found a study done by some professors at Wharton and George Washington University. And what they found is that with the approval of a bond issue for new school construction, housing prices go up 6% before a shovel has gone into the ground. So there is a pretty pronounced impact on local housing prices. That's one study. It was but it's done by some pretty serious professors, and it was the best one I could find.
The questions have been great, but I'm looking at the clock right here, it's getting a little late, and I see some, people starting to yawn a little bit. So we want to alert you what we're going to do next. Groveland here is in the starting process of developing those options that we've been referring to. We're going to run those through our working group and our building committee over the next several weeks. We're going to come back and make a presentation again to the public with our full range of options on February 7th. And I believe that meeting is at 6:30 also, and it's over at Merrimack Town Hall.
Yep.
I think I got that.
Right, so, even though, maybe Groveland is quite three people here as well, it's going to be it's going to have some of this, but it's going to represent the additional work we've done. So, we encourage you all to come, right? Because, this process, it evolves, and before we know it, right, we'll be talking to everybody in the fall, right, about actually where the rubber's going to hit the road, and we're going to fund this thing. And so you people here really are the mouthpieces for the people that aren't here tonight. So we want everybody to be as informed as possible, and we want to be as transparent as possible. And so if you have questions that weren't answered tonight, I would encourage you maybe to email the district, and those can go through Jonathan, and we'll answer. We want everybody, you might not necessarily agree with everything, but we want everybody to have an opportunity to ask the questions that we want to be able to try and answer.
And so after February 7th, the building committee is going to perform an evaluation process. We're going to hear the feedback from you, make any revisions, and then on February 13th, the building committee is going to apply their evaluation process to generate a recommended shortlist. And if they're ready, they'll vote make that submission to the MSBA what that shortlist is. The school committee is expected, I believe, to be in attendance that night as well to hear all of that dialogue. And if they're ready, they're more than welcome to vote that night, but there's a contingency evening of February 27th for the school committee to make a vote to submit. So by March 8th, I believe it is, we're hoping to know what the shortlist of options is and make that formal submission to the MSBA. So the next 6 to 8 weeks are going to be really critical for this first submission to the MSBA.
Are all your presentations available online for us to access?
They are, and we'll make this one available online as well.
Okay.
Is it possible to put your next presentation online before you actually present it?
We can discuss that with the school committee and building committee.
Not now, but maybe a week before.
Couple days.
Yeah, usually we're taking all this information, right, and it's coming right up to the end of the meeting, but we were finishing this up this morning. So, if we can get it together and we can get it out there, we certainly will.
There's a very prominent tab on the high school website in the top left-hand corner that says MSBA Building Project. And any documentation related to the project, from the SOI to the agenda for these meetings, is all right there.
From the design team, I'll just thank you for attending. This was a tremendous turnout for our first public meeting, so thank you. And great discussion.
Thank you.
Andy, I guess I'll turn it back to you.
I know,